Good evening and a very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Golden, the director. It's a great pleasure to see you all here this evening. And a particular pleasure to have Sir John Beddington as the presenter in the seminar series on climate change and what to do about it. Sir John is the senior advisor to the Oxford Martin School, has been that for the past 18 months or so, and is someone who has done exceptionally in the world in connecting science with society in many, many other areas. At the moment, he's also the university professor of natural resource management, but prior to that was the chief scientist for Her Majesty's government from 2008 to 2013. In that capacity, also ran the Government Office of Science, was on chaired the group the scientific advisors across government, and of course was involved in the National Security Council and many social activities. An interesting time, which he maybe will touch on, a time when we had the Icelandic ash cloud, we had pandemic threats, we had the Japanese tsunami and Fukushima meltdown. So many things happening that he was absolutely centrally involved in. So it's a huge pleasure to have him this evening talking about the perfect storm in the intersection of energy, water, food systems with climate change. Sir John.
Well, thank you, Ian, and good afternoon, everybody. As Ian said, for 6 years I was the government chief scientific advisor, and what do you actually learn in Whitehall? I'm not going to talk about this, but Ian did actually refer to one of the jobs, which is that you have to help government in emergencies. And the odd thing about the chief scientific advisor's job is essentially you advise the prime minister of the time. So you advised initially Tony Blair, then Gordon Brown, and then David Cameron. The compare and contrast may have to wait for the memoirs, and ensuring that my Swiss bank accounts are well bolstered and all the things that one must do as one leaves Whitehall. But one of the things that you actually do learn in government is the importance of acronyms. And one of my minor triumphs, in fact, it's a major triumph, was that when Gordon Brown asked me to provide scientific advice in the case of emergencies, and he said he wanted a science advisory group, I said, Prime Minister, would you mind if we called it the Science Advisory Group in Emergencies? And at a stroke, I moved from the acronym SAG to the acronym SAGE. And I think SAG didn't really have quite the ring to it that I wanted from government. But I'm not going to talk about these emergencies today. What I'm going to be talking about is almost a sort of sad story in part, because some of the problems that we face in the 21st century, and these are significant problems, have actually come from rather good things that happened in the previous century. And I'll start off with the first one. Well, in terms of between 1950 and now, there has been enormous strides in medical science. And this key demographic change occurred, and the graph and the table point to the change in life expectancy that has occurred since 1950. I was born in 1945, and a little after I was born, the life expectancy was 66. I'm glad to say I'm exceeding that now, so I've sort of beat the odds. But if you look at the top table on the top left, what you're seeing is really quite a dramatic effect in terms of both developed countries, where the effect is an increase in life expectancy of about 11 years, but in developing countries where it's an increase in life expectancy of about 25 years. And this is quite remarkable. Similar figures are there for infant mortality, showing the decline in infant mortality that actually occurred over the same sort of period. Now, this is marvelous, People want to live longer. You don't want a high proportion of children dying, but of course it has a consequence, and that consequence is enormous increases in population over the same period. When I was born, there were about 2 billion people on the planet. By the turn of the century, there were 6 billion. no causal mechanism there, I'm glad to say, but you can see, and albeit that there is some slowing down of the rate increase of the world population, and I'll come back to this on a couple of occasions during the afternoon, the basic increments that are occurring are really quite dramatic, and the consequences of that increased population are really quite profound, and I'll come to that later. And the other indicators, and again this is a good news story from the 20th century, is that in a sense, albeit there are significant pockets of poverty, and actually very large pockets tragically, the real income per capita, so the average income per human beings has increased really quite dramatically, which is shown in the top left-hand graph. And actually that distribution, particularly in the rise of what you might very roughly call the middle classes, actually occurred during these last few decades of the 20th century. And all of it, it's very hard to think that this is a tragedy. It's a good thing. It's a thing that has meant that and the various drivers for that. And that is actually something rather attractive that has happened at that time. But there are consequences from these. And for example, just taking fossil fuels, which, this is in the series dealing with climate change, which I'll come back to at the moment, but world fossil fuel consumption soared with the increase in human population and the increase in the wealth of that human population. And other resources have also soared in terms of their use. For example, our global water consumption has soared in the same period that I'm talking about in the last few decades of the 20th century. And there's been big consequences, so that we were starting the 20th century with really big problems. For example, land use change. There's various bullets in here which, I have a working assumption that an audience like this can read, so I won't read the bullets to you. But I think I'd probably point to them that, vastly amounts of land were converted to cropland in the decades after the 1950, after the Second World War, and that there has been real problems. So something of the order of a quarter of usable land is degraded, and about a fifth of all pasture land has been damaged, and there's been massive problems to do with degradation of ecosystems and their general habitat. All of that are the sort of sad and unintended consequences of two good things, essentially the improvement in mortality for adults and children, and the fact that the world was getting more prosperous. And one of the ones that, of course, people are familiar with is the carbon dioxide emissions soaring from 1950 onwards into the period into the 2000s, and that continues on further. And of course it's had consequences for ecosystems. There's three things here, three particular subsets of this slide. One of them is in terms of fisheries, in which fisheries expansion between 1950, in which the degree of shading, the red and the yellow, shows the level of exploitation of fish stocks in the ocean. In 1950, relatively modest. By 2005, almost ubiquitous and big problems in the world. And it's the same thing in the context of biodiversity, big increases in extinctions of animals and plants, and of course the thing that many people are familiar with is the decline in forest cover that's occurring. So that was, in a sense, the legacy of the 20th century. Now, good things happened, but there have been very, very bad consequences of those good things. And just to give you a flavour for it, I talked about inequality, and there's really very sad consequences. The top left slide points to two things. One is the people who, in a sense, don't have sufficient to eat, who are starving, and that is on the left-hand side, and the way that one can calculate it is the biomass index, the BMI index, which points to that about something of the order, if you average across these individual countries, about 15% of people have a BMI index, and this is women, of less than 18, which means they're starving. By contrast, almost the same proportion in the developing world have a BMI index of greater than 30, which means they're obese and will have cardiovascular and early onset diabetes problems in their health. And yet the same countries have almost the same proportion. And it's not that the bigger ones get more to eat. It really is a consequence of a very poor diet. And there are other issues which will come before. There's been a massive urbanization, I'll come to it. And of course, there have been big problems in terms of the pressures, and I've referred to those already, on natural resources that are out there. And again, I'll refer to this. At the same time, actually, you know, my background is in science, there's been an enormous explosion, and the bottom right-hand graph points to the number of articles, scientific articles published per year, and showing the way in which they've actually soared in the last decades of the 20th century, but have really started to increase dramatically in the first decade of the 21st. Now, the world is uncertain, but in very key ways, what's going to happen is known. There are inexorable changes that are happening, which are not going to be stopped or reversed. I'll take point, first of all, to demography, and I'll go into a little detail of that later on, that demography can't really change. The people born, the fertility rates will change in a marginal way, but it's going to be pretty much determined. So that population growth graph that I showed you, the 6 billion people, several decades after I was born, when there were 2 billion, are now 7 and approaching 8 billion. And people can say, well, what about epidemics and so on? They aren't going to have any real effect on that population change. To give you a flavour for it, the worst pandemic that has occurred in sort of modern history, I'm not thinking about things like the Black Death, but there was the Spanish influenza that followed the Second World War. They reckon about maybe 100 million people died. The increment of human population at the moment is 70 million a year. So even if we had what was an extraordinarily wide and vicious pandemic, like the Spanish flu, it would hardly make a blip on population. The second thing that seems to be inexorable is a trend of increase in the population of the world that lives in urban environments. And that comes both from natural growth in urban centres, but also in terms of the migration occurring almost ubiquitously throughout the developing world from the rural hinterland into the cities. And the third one that is inexorable, and I'll go into a little bit more detail into that, is that climate change is happening, and even if we acted now, it would still continue to happen. So the three things, and none of them are particularly attractive in terms of the human condition, are going to continue pretty much whatever we do, at least for decades or so. Let me go to population. If we say at the tail end of the 20th century there were 6 billion people, by 2011 there was another billion, and by 2025 there's going to be another billion still. I can't get too excited about 2043 because I'll be 98 at that time, and I think I will be taking only what one might call an academic interest in the world around me at that time. But 2025, another billion people. And the graph on the top left points to the fact that that extra billion is actually going to come in two areas. It's going to come in Africa, which will go up from about 1 billion to 1.5 billion, so a 50% increase in about 12 years. And in Asia, which will also increase by about 500 million, but it'll go from 4 billion to 4.5 billion, so a much smaller proportional increase. And that is what is happening to the world population. And as I said earlier, that's going to happen. There's not change due to disaster, short of perhaps an intercontinental nuclear war is not going to affect that the number of people who are out there. And the other one is urbanization. And the urban concentrations, this shows the projection into 2025, that essentially 2010 was the first time that the urban population exceeded the rural, and it's projected that the rural population will continue to decline, whereas the urban one will continue to increase. And to give you some sort of slightly parochial flavour on that, in Africa, in the next 12 years, there will be about 1,000 cities the size of Edinburgh will develop, and that's in Africa. In Asia, it's about 500 cities, but about 1 million per person. So this is the sort of changes that are actually going to happen, and they're going to present really quite dramatic problems. One of the things you can observe from this map is that an awful lot of these urban concentrations occur in coastal or delta regions, and in consequence will be affected in part by climate change. And the other thing that's happening is following on from the trend of the 20th century, and this comes from one of the Oxford Martin Commission on Future Generations, which I'm sure other speakers have referred to, points to an increase in what we might call the rise of the global middle class. First of all, a decline in poverty, which is good. The circles at the bottom, the size of the circles reflect the number of people in poverty, i.e. less than $1.25 a day. And that's improved a lot, but also in terms of the middle classes. People that the World Bank would describe as middle classes, and of course that varies. What is middle class in America would be very different from what is middle class in Africa or Southeast Asia. But those middle classes are increasing, and to give you a flavour for it, in the developing world, there's about 1 billion people who would be termed as middle class, and that is increasing by 100 million a year. So in 10 years, the number of middle class people will actually double, and to about 2 billion, and it will have an 8 billion population. Now, of course, that's going to have an enormous effect on the demand for natural resources. And with some degree of narcissism, I entitled the Perfect Storm Revisited, because shortly after I took over as government chief scientist, we had the first change that we had seen in real food prices. They soared in 2007-8 for the first time for 40 years. And I started to think about this, and and it seemed to me that the population increase, the increasing purchasing power, meant that the basic resources of energy, food and water would be, the demand for them would be dramatically increasing. And going forward to 2030, something of the order of 40% more energy is required, something like 40% more food, and something like 50% more water, more available fresh water is going to be required. And at the same time as meeting those demands from the increasing and increasingly wealthy population, you had climate change. And I call it a perfect storm because all these things are happening over the next couple of decades. You need to address these food, water, and energy security issues. And at the same time, you've got to be thinking about mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I can't claim my great success in terms of moving SAG to SAGE, but coining a neat little phrase does ensure that you're covered by the appropriate media. So by calling it the perfect storm, I got a reasonable amount of media coverage from it. I want to go into some of the issues of it. Let's look at energy and climate change first of all. Now, why do we have, I have got some colleagues here who know vastly more about climate modelling and the whole climate issues than I do. That is actually the role of a chief scientific advisor, is that pretty much whatever group he talks to know more about any particular subject than he does. I'm less nervous here than I was when I think my second lecture I ever gave as chief scientist was the National Farmers Union, where I had 2,500 farmers who all hated government, and most of whom were not entirely sober, as it was their annual meeting. And and it was snowing outside, and trying to talk about global warming when we had 6 inches of snow outside, it was about -10, was a challenge, shall we say. I feel less challenged here. But why are we worried about climate change? Well, one of the issues is to do with natural disasters. And the graph is slightly complex, but let me just point to it. The width of these little squiggles points to the number of natural disasters that have actually occurred. And the blue ones are related to climate and weather, and the red ones are related to geological phenomena, for example, earthquakes or tsunamis or volcanic eruptions. What you can see is that in the case of the natural disasters coming from geological issues, there's really no trend. But the trends that are actually coming from climate-related disasters and weather-related disasters have soared. Now, in part, that's due to an arguably increased vulnerability as more people living in cities. But it's a trend that we have to expect, and all the climate modelling points to the potential for more variability. And one of the things about this is this is a graph of the number of disasters recorded by one of the main reinsurance companies, Munich. And they've looked at natural disasters, and of course a reinsurance company has to think about those. And if you look at the natural disasters, this is the red line that I've imposed there is the changes in carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So as you can see, they're really quite correlated, but there's an important caveat here, because there's a time delay in the climate system. And that time delay points to the fact that, in a sense, the weather we're getting now is determined by greenhouse gas concentrations about 20 years ago, because there's a 20-year time lag in which the emissions move through the system, primarily because of the oceans, but not entirely. And so the sort of causal mechanism that I'm pointing to there is the red line, where it is generating disasters about 20 years later. And of course, if you extrapolate from now, where greenhouse gas emissions and concentration in the atmosphere are significantly higher than they were in the 1990s, we have to have an expectation that disasters will increase into the future. And of course, this is very much the business of the insurance companies, but it's also our business as humanity. And that is bad enough in the sense, if I could persuade the Prime Minister and indeed the heads of state of all the countries attending the climate discussions in Paris, and they were agreed to cut greenhouse gas emissions immediately, what would still happen is that there would be the effect of those emissions occurring over the following couple of decades. And if we extrapolate, and the red line shows the sort of upper and lower expectation of what might be business as usual or indeed worse, you can see that there is a real potential for really quite dramatic changes in weather, which will affect everybody, obviously differentially depending on different geographic regions. And you know, everybody knows about these things, but let me just give you a feeling for the scale of it. And take the US. First of all, you know, it's a big continent and a big country, but things to do with snow, major increases in very high snowfalls. But let me focus on the bottom right, which is essentially Californian droughts. Now, the set of little lines, the black line shows the average over the last 100 years or so, and the red line is the driest period. The blue line at the top is the wettest, and the little line at the bottom, which is noted as 2013-14, that's actually what happened last year. So it's a 1 in 100 year event. It's so dry. And these are the sort of expectations we've got to have for the future. And sadly, the Conference of the Parties has really failed to reach any agreement on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and many of you will have been concerned by that. There's a meeting in Paris at the end of this year. There's some reasons for hope that which I point to in the bullets at the bottom. I I don't think the Beddington shirt would go on there being an agreement that would be comprehensive and legally binding on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by what is several hundred countries having to agree. And my own view is that given the states attending, the idea that they could agree on which day of the week it is may be a fairly challenging agenda for them. So that's the problem there. And of course, focusing back, all these things are interrelated. I've pointed to the fact we're thinking about energy and climate change. You can't do them. The top left graph points to the demand in primary energy, almost entirely coming from the developing world. Pardon me. So the developed world will have some, but the main increase is in the developing world. Just to give you a flavour of what is worrying, is that there is the Conference of the Parties had indicated that they should have a 2-degree target, so that the worst climate change that one would allow, in the sense the nation states going there, agreed that they should have a target of no greater than 2 degrees, roughly equivalent to a particular level of carbon dioxide and associated other gases in the atmosphere. Now, coal-fired power plants, the red shading points to the number of new coal-fired plants that would actually increase the level of greenhouse gas emissions to a level that would be compatible with 450 parts per million. The dark blue shading is those that are actually already under construction, which quite often exceeds that, and the pale blue shading shows the ones that are planned, particularly in China and India. So the idea that we are actually going to see something that is compatible with 450 parts per million or a 2-degree equivalent temperature rise seems to me to be extraordinarily unlikely, unless one can think about ways to do it. And just to give you some flavours for this, the top left-hand is a picture from NASA, which was taken at night from a satellite, and the bright pieces on that are essentially light emissions. And the light emissions point to major cities, but the one, Minneapolis and Dallas are labelled, but the Bakken Formation in North Dakota is one where shale gas and shale oil are extracted. And why is there this bright light patch around there? And the answer is because they're burning gas, because they want the oil, and gas is almost a waste product. And that's the sort of scale that you're observing, and this is a NASA picture. And also in an ironic way, one of the effects of climate change is that it affects the Arctic rather more, and as the Arctic sea ice has shrunk, it's actually opened up very significant reserves of oil and gas, which are essentially undiscovered and unexploited reserves. And that is going, I suspect, will be a next rush. And finally, coal. There's massive amounts of coal. It seems to me highly unlikely it won't be used. So, where can we have some hope? Well, there are renewables, there is development, there's also nuclear, and the development of these areas and the potential not just to accept carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases, but actually thinking about some mechanisms and some technology to sequester carbon dioxide, the carbon capture and sequestration, one of the things that have been looked at, but they are pitifully small in the context of the amount that needs to be done. And obviously there's issues to do with various renewables. Solar, wind are the two that we are mainly thinking about in the UK. And there are things that are quite good. This is the approximate change in the cost of solar over something like 25 years since 1990. And coming down, still not down to the scale where it can compete with coal. And cities. This is a sort of extraordinary picture. Barcelona and Atlanta have roughly the same population, about 2.7 million. The grey shading, which is very large in the case of Atlanta, and the grey shading in Barcelona is significantly smaller, that's, as it were, the urban area. And you can see that, albeit they have the same population, The urban area in the case of Atlanta is something like 30 times that it is in Barcelona. And of course, these things, apart from transport things, shows that effectively the carbon emissions from just getting around in Barcelona is a tenth per capita of what it is in Atlanta. And if you then think about these issues for 1,000 cities the size of Edinburgh that will occur in primarily in West Africa, the 500 cities of 1 million that will be occurring in Asia, the potential for that to be a real mess is very significant. And it's actually in a mess not just in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, but there's enormous problems of pollution. And air pollution is seen as in major cities, particularly in the developing world, is likely to be the main cause of premature mortality. You can not, however, take comfort with this extra premature mortality means that you slow the population growth. It doesn't even scratch the surface. It just means that you actually have a lot of human suffering and unnecessarily suffering in human health. So let me move from energy and climate change to energy and water. Water is probably the area of natural resources that worries me most. This is a busy graph, so let me just start in the bottom left-hand corner. And it shows that that water reuse by agriculture is vastly greater than that for either industry or domestic use. And there's a gap, and that's the top graph, which shows that essentially the supplies as we go out to about 2030, we're going to be about 60% short of available fresh water for activities. And the normal activities, whether it's agricultural, domestic, or industrial. And the top right-hand graph, which is a picture of India, and the level of shading, the red points to overexploited aquifers, i.e. water resources below the surface, and the green is what have those that have been so overexploited they become saline. And to give you a sort of simple analogy of it, the water that is being used for irrigation in northwest India is about 200 years old. So what is being pumped out of the ground is about 200 years old, sometimes larger, and that's used for today's irrigation. And therefore, these aquifers, which are enormously important for agriculture in India, are going to essentially run out. They'll go saline and there won't be a source of water. Massive potential for human tragedy. And just to sort of lighten things, in a sense, probably the maddest piece of agriculture in terms of the conservation of natural resources is the agriculture in Saudi Arabia, which actually is the green circles in which they are using this from oil-driven pumps to actually keep the circles green. This is not advised for the future. So that's one of the problems with water. And these things interact. So I talked about energy, but the energy sector and the agricultural sector accounts for about the energy sector accounts for 15% of global water use, and agriculture accounts for about 70%. And so the effect of increasing the demand, of meeting the increased demand for energy is likely to mean that we have an increased demand for water. So these things are closely interacting. Let me now move to the issue of food. Again, this goes back to some of the earlier points I've made, is that the increase in human population and the increase in wealth means that food production needs to rise, something on the world as a whole by about 40% by 2030. And that's 15 years away. The change, it's a major issue of meeting that demand, and there have been big developments in agronomy. The bottom graph shows the increase in yield of two major world crops, wheat and maize, and they have done rather well. The increase per hectare has gone up, has improved, but the anticipated demand is just nowhere near the level of the levels that's required. And agriculture, again, it's not just water use, but agriculture is about 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Again, I emphasize these things are all interacting. They're interacting not in a comfortable way and mutually supporting. They're interacting in a mischievous way. And the use, there's various things, the energy use in agriculture, but also the chopping down of trees and the changing of the environment to focus on agriculture is by far the largest. But agriculture, if it's to meet the requirements of food and to stay in using the same sort of agriculture that has happened over the last 4 or 5 decades, will mean a big increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a big issue. So if we're trying to feed the world, and we want to feed the world in the same way that we've done in the last few decades, that's going to have consequences for energy use and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, this, there's the market. After my perfect storm speech, the world of the economists, and I'm conscious that Ian Goldin, who was very kind enough to give me a nice introduction, is actually an economist, so I better be slightly careful about what I say. Economists said, oh, this is nonsense. The price has gone up, so the supply will go up, and, the supply will meet it. And indeed that did happen, and it's happening now, but the peak to the right-hand side was showing the world index of food prices, which soared for the first time for several decades in the 2007-8 period, and it fell off, but then it went up again. Currently we're in a period of a decline in real food prices, largely determined by the decline in oil prices, it has to be said. But don't be complacent. Cheap food is going to be a pretty temporary phenomenon, because all these factors that I've been pointing to point to life being difficult in the future. And there's some things that can be done in agriculture. There are things you can do in terms of rather more effective agronomy. Rice intensification is practiced in parts of Southeast Asia works. And an oddly thing is that in a sense we are underutilizing the biodiversity of the planet. And the first bullet point in the second half of the slide points that just 12 species provide 80% of the plant food, and yet we know that something of the order of 30,000 species are known to be edible, and about 70,000 are semi-domesticated. And that's a real opportunity. Most agricultural research goes into maize, wheat, corn, and major cereals like that. So there's some opportunities there. And also science. There's an enormous opportunity in terms of our understanding of the plant genome. I find I'm unable to explain, but the wheat genome is 5 times more complicated than the human genome. I don't understand why. This may be God's plan for the universe, as it were, and certainly John Beddington doesn't understand why it is the case, but it is the case. But we do have an enormous idea about thinking about understanding the genetics of plant species and the potential not just to do several things, but to actually use that knowledge of genetics to improve conventional breeding, but also to think about GM technology to actually change the genes in plants to do it. And of course that's a problem. But society does adopt technology at increasing pace. So in a sense, if we did get some changes that would be done, you can see this graph, which amuses me, points to the fact that it took something of the order of 50 years for electricity to be adopted in America by a quarter of the population, and about 7 years to have the World Wide Web adopted by 25% of the population. So that's happening. But there's a very unfortunate legacy of the 20th century. And that unfortunate legacy is the political reactions that have actually occurred due to really bad practice. There were terrible things happening from about 1950 onwards. The book by Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, other studies pointed to a real failure both of government and industrial practice. And it's produced a major misunderstanding of modern agriculture and a dislike of it. And to an extent, that is probably, in my view, has gone rather too far. So, for example, in terms of pesticides, quite properly one needs to regulate them, but it's gone, in my view, well beyond what the scientific evidence can support. So the one that everyone was concerned about is the neonicotinoids, insecticides, which were seen as being implicated in the decline of pollinators, in particular bees. I say seen as, but colleagues here in Oxford with others actually examined the evidence on that. They point to the fact that the declines in honeybees began well prior to the use of neonicotinoids, that there's no geographical correlation. For example, Hungary has the highest use of neonicotinoids pesticides, and its honeybee populations are increasing, and that many of the demonstrations have resulted in, many of the experiments are really sort of very odd, like about the level of some experiments looking at the deleterious effect of these pesticides on honeybees was round about a factor of 30 higher than what they would actually encounter naturally. So they died, big surprise. And geometrically modified organisms. Europe is totally different from the rest of the world. Only one GM crop has been approved in Europe. They are ubiquitous in parts of the developing world, but also in North America and parts of Southeast Asia. And they have advantages. The UK Council for Science and Technology is the main body that advises the Prime Minister. I chaired it under Gordon Brown and David Cameron. And they did a study and pointed at that over the 20 years or so that they've been cultivated, they're about 12% of the arable rain, but there are no risks of any transgenes being identified. And the point that is made in the second bullet is that America is quite a litigious society, arguably is more litigious than even something like Seneca's Rome. And there have been no legal cases in which people have sued companies on the basis of harm to humans. Doesn't mean to say that not there, but there's no rational basis for the complete ban on GM crops in Europe and the impossibility of actually getting them adopted. Now, that's evidence. And politically, there's very different attitudes to scientific evidence. Let me just show you, make two quotes from two people who I really envy because they have marvelous script writers. I wish I had. But Obama, talking about science, says promoting science isn't just about providing resources, it's about protecting free and open inquiry. It's about listening to what scientists tell us, even when it's inconvenient. In fact, especially when it's inconvenient. Very nice view of the way evidence should be taken. So if somebody comes up with scientific evidence which is politically extremely inconvenient, you still got to listen. And in case of Stephen Chu, who was a Nobel laureate and former US Secretary of Energy, has a nice way of putting it. And this came from a discussion about climate change with the governors of the western states in the USA, not the most, shall we say, liberal. And he said people are entitled to their own opinions, but not entitled to their own facts. A very nice epigrammatic way. Now that's the evidence from the USA, and one would not say the USA was particularly marvelous in the way it deals evidence, but certainly at the highest level it has done. And then very sadly, I compare and contrast it with Europe, where the new President Juncker said Europeans should be given a majority view of democratically elected, give the same weight as scientific evidence. Extraordinary. He's saying the political views should outweigh or be at least as equal as the scientific evidence. And we've seen the consequences of that. Anne Glover, who had been the chief scientific advisor in Scotland, became the chief scientific advisor to Barroso. Essentially, she was fired. The green organizations wrote to Juncker and said she should be fired because her views on GM are not typical. A fact that there is a ubiquitous view in the scientific community that these things are not happening. So that's very sad, and something that I personally find very, very worrying, that European science has got this headline from the BBC News is the European scientists have a great leap backward, and pretty much the whole research community thought that the idea of firing a chief scientific advisor and saying, I don't want a chief scientific advisor, arguably because they might provide scientific evidence which is inconvenient, as opposed to Obama, is, I think, appallingly sad and presents real problems. Because at the moment, there is a view in the community that climate change is correct. And why is that correct? It's correct because it is based on the consensus of the scientific community. And so our heir to the throne, Prince Charles, is a firm believer that climate change is happening, and he points to the fact that this is supported by the vast majority of scientists. By contrast, he is bitterly against GM technology, which is supported by a tiny, tiny proportion of anybody who's ever worked in this field. So, a bit of consistency issue here, but I better stop there because I think I might be moving into the treason regime, and I'm worried about my pension and things like that. So let me sum up in terms of the challenges up to 2030. There's going to be a population will be 1 billion or more in the next 15 years. The population increase will concentrate in cities. There will be a more prosperous world. Globalization is meaning that the world is getting more prosperous. There are going to be complicated demographic trends. There's issues to do with migration, and climate change is definitely happening. So it's summed up in the table below that we need about, by 2030, about 40% more food, 40% more water, and about 55% more energy. And things are happening. This comes again from the Oxford Martin Commission, and it points to the fact that if we think about the last few decades, things have changed, and the picture of the globe with the circle in it points to half the world's population lives in that circle. And the bullet points below it point that Africa in 2030, there will be 1.6 billion people, 800 million in the working population. In Europe, there will be 700 million people, and about less than half will be of working age than in Africa. And in Asia, it's just off the scale. Nearly 5 billion people, of which 3 and a bit billion will be of working age. The economic strength and the economic changes that are actually going to be brought about by that are the sort of thing that one should be thinking about and thinking how you address it. So in the last bit of my cheery lecture, most people have said to me that thank God he talks in the evening, at least I can have a drink afterwards. And I gave a talk not so long ago, and one of my grandchildren were there, and my sort of youngest but one grandson said, "It's all right for you, it's really terribly depressing, and I'm not allowed to have a drink because I'm only 9. What can one say? A true statement. But let me think about the last couple of things. First of all, are we worried? And we really should be worried. The first thing is in terms of global population. Demography is pretty inexorable. And at the moment, the left-hand graph I'll deal with, which is more detailed. The right one is somewhat more complicated, and I'll just talk to it. But these are the scenarios. The central line with the blue shading around it is the best estimate of what the world population will do. It is slowing down in terms of increase, but it depends on something really quite dramatic, which is a decline in female fertility. Because as I've said, mortality rates are declining, and that adult longevity is increasing. Now, if we don't get a decline in female fertility, then we're looking not at a 9 billion or a 10 billion population in the next few decades. We're looking about something significantly more. And there will be almost what I call a tipping point, that unless you do it, and you actually see a decline in female fertility, the number of people who are childbreeding age will increase so much that even if there is a decline in fertility, the net effect will be quite dramatic. And in a sense, one knows things that actually reduce fertility. It is prosperity, it is the education of women, and it is the availability of contraception. And those are the things that are just not really talked about widely enough in my view, because if we don't slow that population growth, or at least keep it within bounds, we're talking about, and the upper line is probably a bit scary, but something significantly above the projections could easily happen if we don't address it. And in terms of climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions, we have a short window to actually see a decline, and the business as usual scenarios are the red shading, and the blue and the green are scenarios which hopefully would be compatible, the blue with 2 degrees, but they involve a decline in greenhouse gas emissions of a dramatic amount from 2020 onwards. If you don't have it, it's going to be very, very difficult to do. And because of the time delays in the system, if you don't see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions fairly soon, you will see an increase in the accumulation, and that means that our weather for the next 20 years or so is going to be more variable and more mischievous. I think that's probably the word. So finally, what up to 2050? Well, the first thing about 2050 that I think is I should be 105 years of age, so it's down to the younger generation to worry about 2050. But there'll be 2.3 billion more people, could be as high as 4 billion, depending on the demographic response. 70% of the world will live in cities. It will be more prosperous, likely, but there will be potential changes in the tipping points, and the top right-hand graph points to some of the things that actually might happen, like a dieback of the Amazon rainforest, a melting of the tundra with the corresponding increase in methane as the vegetation in the tundra melts. And the basic policy with no change is you're going to need about 60% more food, 55% more water, and 80% more energy. And if you don't see some action, the business as usual scenario is likely we'll have by 2050 about 52% more emissions coming out per annum. So there's some big challenges. There's some big challenges in the next 15 years to 2030, and there's some even bigger challenges as we move out to the 35 years or so to 2050. So it's a tough old world. When I talked in 2008 about the perfect storm, I kind of hoped that things would improve. I have to say they've not. If anything, they're more challenging and more difficult. Well, you all look suitably glum. So now I will thank you for your attention and finish my speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir John. The Oxford Martin School was established to deal with the biggest challenges of the 21st century, and the ones that you've been talking about, energy, food, water, climate, and population, are of course absolutely central. And we're absolutely delighted that you're here with us, helping us work more effectively on these, and we really have been most fortunate that Sir John has become the advisor to the school. We have about half an hour for questions and answers, and this is being webcast and filmed, so if you would not like to be recorded, I suggest you don't say anything.
That may include me.
Too late for you. Please identify yourselves too. The woman over here.
Sue Roberts.
Well, just wait for a microphone.
Sue Roberts from Sustainable Wallingford. I was quite interested in that last bit with the question mark after it, the more prosperous world.
Yeah.
It does seem to me that economists are presuming that that will be the case. With all of your perfect storm factors coming into play, doesn't that immediately counter that possibility?
I think there will be a feedback, and of course one of the issues is going to be how much globalization occurs and how resources will improve. I think the expectation is that there will be an improvement in global living standards, but also in terms of the demand. And I think one of the things that actually is leading to it is the urbanization. Awful lot more people are moving into cities, and the trends are dramatic. And so in a sense, you're seeing people move from the rural hinterland, where life is rather more simple, but poverty is there, and people are moving into the cities, becoming somewhat more prosperous there, though there are obviously major pockets of poverty, and that is actually feeding the demand. I think that the sort of things that are interesting too are to do with lifestyle. For example, the change in eating habits that occurs in Southeast Asia has moved from a very simple grain, vegetable-based diet to essentially one that is dependent on dairy products and livestock. And that seems to be a big change. That, interestingly, is not actually happening in India at the moment due to cultural differences. So if we all developed like Indians, things would be would not be as bad as if we all developed like Britons or Americans or indeed Chinese. Chinese per capita consumption of livestock has gone up by a factor of 250% in the last 30 years. So it's tough, but very interesting question.
Gentleman in the front here.
Nicholas Brazilian.
Let's wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm an art historian, a rare creature in this building, interested in the relationship between the visual arts and the changing human ecology. And I remember in the 70s, we began by reading The Limits to Growth. So there was a very simple number of constraints which would put an end to growth in some future point without actually arguing as to how the world would live without growth. And I wonder whether you see now that constraint still applying, still forcing in some way a limitation on demographic growth, or whether you see the capitalist desired pattern of growth continuing into an indefinite future.
Well, I think the concern I have is that we won't get it right. The Meadows work in the 70s on the limits to growth was actually moderately optimistic, saying that we'll get some feedback, people will cut back on resources. Well, there's actually no evidence that is happening at all. The last 3 or 4 decades. Now, what are we looking at now? We're looking, because of a big increase in the oil supply, historically low oil prices. Well, that is not, I'm not an economist, but it will tell me that if the oil prices drop like a stone and other energy prices have dropped like a stone, people are going to use more. I think there are going to be issues, because you have got to ask where the growth is coming from. If it's to do with growth of consumption, where is the wealth? And I think that you also have a moral dilemma that there are about 1 billion people who live in poverty, and I mean less than $1.25 a day. There's about another 1 billion people who actually don't have appropriate diets, either due to significant malnutrition or significant overeating. As you address those problems, it is actually going to put more pressure on natural resources. So I think that in a sense, if I think that there is some degree of saving, I really think it's in the development of science and technology, because I think that I can't see these natural forces doing it. We will screw up, we will overexploit. You just have to look that we've got 25% of arable land is now ruined. So I think that there's the natural feedbacks that one might hope to have, which in a sense were assumed in the Meadows and others were. I just don't think them happening in a timely way. I think what have happen is that you'll see a development and essentially catastrophes. And that's the sort of concern I have. The food price is currently declining, courtesy of the oil price, but the increase in 2011, following a heat wave in Russia and the Ukraine, and a big increase in wildfires, the food price went up by the fastest it's ever been in the history of the index being done. And I fear that a bad harvest or two in the Ukraine or Argentina or Russia or Central America would generate those sorts of problems again. Water also. What's the feedback mechanism? People are going to need water. Very, very hard to see that actually being done in an efficient way. But we need to be thinking about smarter ways to conserve water, smarter ways. For example, the Chinese have started to develop underground reservoirs, so that with the glacial melt that's occurring in the sort of subtropical glaciers, in the country, the water as it melts, they are now actually capturing underground. Now that's the sort of thing that is really quite sensible. But Sao Paulo, one of the biggest cities in South America, in fact the biggest city in South America, something like 20 million people, is on a rationing of water only 2 days a week. 2 days a week. And that's the largest and most prosperous city in South America. And just to give you a flavour of what Sao Paulo is like, they describe the traffic jams in terms of the number of kilometres of stationary traffic. And when you leave home in the morning in Sao Paulo and they say there's 127 kilometres of stationary traffic, you know it's going to be a long commute to work. Please.
Is that Lillian in the back there? So.
Sorry, can you speak louder? I'm
stand
elderly and I don't pick up the noise, so I'll come back and listen.
Hi there, I'm Rebecca. I'm a freelance consultant on sustainable food and agriculture. My question to you is that you've obviously focused on crops like wheat and rice, and recently the UN FAO director has talked about the need for an alternative approach to agriculture and talked about climate smart agriculture and the use of underutilised crops. And I wanted to know how you could see that as a sort of solution and how it could be incorporated in the most ethical way, because obviously they're grown by smallholder farmers and people that haven't had ownership of science and technology, of knowledge in the past.
Very good question. There was some work that I did about 2 years ago on agriculture and climate change. And that led to some of these ideas on what we call climate smart agriculture. And this is an agriculture which is using agriculture not as a problem for greenhouse gas emissions, but as a partial solution. So there's certain agricultural techniques that one can actually use which will sequester carbon dioxide. So for example, a mix of simple arable crops with scrub forestry can actually involve increases in yield because they're sheltered, but also a sequestration of the of carbon dioxide in that. And the sort of interventions that World Bank has done with, and actually they're sort of tentative at the moment, and they're sort of what you might call pilot projects, is to actually pay smallholders for actually the amount of carbon that they sequester in their changed agricultural practice. So they have the potential to have an increase in productivity, which improves their prosperity, but at the same time they actually get an input in from the international aid agencies to encourage them to do that. There's a whole series of other ways you can do it. You can be thinking about different plant strains which have much bigger roots, for example. You can think about low tillage activity, and this is, I think, one of the real ways that one can improve it. There is a real temptation in smallholder agriculture is to make it more like agribusiness. And the level of yield of small farmers in Africa is about a tonne a hectare. Typically, that could go up to about 4 tonnes a hectare with relatively low-tech intervention. You're not talking about complex seeds, complex pesticides, complex use of fertilizers. So there is some hope there, but if you could actually combine that with some agricultural practice which is satisfactory and profitable to the farmer, and at the same time you get some subsidy, that seems to me to be really attractive. There's a publication of the World Bank called Climate Smart Agriculture, which came out last year, which I think has a lot of these ideas in. And I think this is really an exciting way to be thinking about it, because we've got to have, and you're not going to get a silver bullet. You're not going to get one answer, but there'll be a mix of technologies which need to be addressed. And I think climate smart agriculture is one of the ones that would actually do it, because it doesn't have to be just climate smart. It could be water smart, it could be energy smart, and that would be what one wants, is the development of agricultural technologies which produce more food, but do it using less fertilizer, less water, and less energy. And that's the sort of thing that we need to be investing in. And to an extent, that happens a bit here in the developed world, where use of satellite technology means that you use less pesticides. Use of satellite technology and precision agriculture can mean you lose less fertilizer. But there's some big problems. Nitrogen fertilizer is expensive. It involves producing lots of greenhouse gases to produce. And the level of nitrogen fertilizer use in South Asia, particularly China, is about twice that which would actually give you an optimum yield. So you're actually eroding the yield by using too much fertilizer. So there's things that you can do, and it's not high tech. It's relatively straightforward.
The gentleman over here. All right.
Hello, my name's Ray Taylor, and I work on food security in.
If you can stand here, because they're filming you.
Well, I'm really sorry, but I can't hear if I stand there.
I'll try and speak up.
I'll just have to go off thing. Okay, I'm here then.
So, Ray Taylor, working on food security in global catastrophic scenarios, and I find I get much more hopeful when I assume the worst from the governments and politicians, and then see how would we deal with that. So I'm currently supporting Dr. David Denkenberger, who's written on some of the technical solutions for how everyone could be fed in catastrophic scenarios. And I kind of wanted to ask you about the politics because of your experience with the British government. So if we think we have technical solutions for extreme scenarios where we lose 10% or more of the global harvests, who would start to act and coordinate other than the World Food Programme? Who? Because I find a dearth of literature on the politics of that, whereas quite a lot on risks and technical solutions.
Okay, well, in terms of who does it, I think that, for example, the CGIAR system, which your colleague sat next to and your immediate right is involved in, this is about $1 billion a year spent on research by the CGIAR system, and the focus there is on practical solutions, developing science and technology, which actually have some practical implications. So that's really quite important. Interestingly, a vast amount of money is actually spent by industry on developing solutions, and that tends to be the investment on crops that would not necessarily help the poorest. So one needs to be thinking about the aid industry to improve that. Waste is an enormous issue. Give or take, about 30% of arable crops are lost before harvest, and about another 30% of the residual is lost due to poor storage. That's an enormous potential for doing it, and it's the sort of thing that interventions could actually fairly straightforwardly improve, so you have improved pest control and so on. You asked a question about the sort of politics of it. Well, it's sort of, if we talk about food, well, I think that there is a concern, and following a study that I funded and commissioned on the future of food and farming, the UK government changed its policy on food and moved to one which was looking much more about sustainability rather than, I suppose, for example, environmental impact. And there had been a long period where, in fact, environmental impact was seen as more important in terms of research. It is important, but compared with improvements in agricultural practice or emissions and so on. So I think that there is some hope. But I don't know who's going to be running the country in 2015, come May 6th, is it? So who knows? But I think that there is. I think that there are signs that there are concerns, and the fact that there is an aid budget, that it focuses on some of these issues, and the World Food Programme, which you mentioned, is obviously one of the ones that do it. But there are a whole series of organisations which need to get together, and I mentioned I sit on a global panel that deals with agriculture and nutrition, which is aiming to think hard about the way in which one can change the current practice of the food industry to move towards cash crops and greater profitability to something where you actually think about the nutritional aspects of food. So it's not much good to change a small-scale farming community from producing vegetables and small-scale livestock to one that produces cereals and sell it on the world market, because you have this sort of you're more prosperous, but you've got a terrible diet. So there's issues like this. You're not going to get a quick solution to these things, but you've got to be thinking about it and saying, this is something that will needs to be addressed now. To ignore it, and frankly, until 2007, people were saying that the real problem was gluts. that, you know, that there had been a decline in real food prices since the OPEC-driven oil price increase, and real food prices had declined. So, you know, I remember when I first went on, you know, these programs on the TV where you sit on a couch and are patronised by idiots, the early morning ones. And I remember this woman saying, I won't name which interview it was, but she said, oh, but, you know, we've got far too much food, all these mountains, you know, and lakes and things like that. And, well, I, in the nicest possible way, with my best boyish smile, tried to put her right. Camilla.
Yes, my name's Camilla Tallman. I'm director of an institute in London called IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development, and also engaged with the CGIAR. So I swim in acronym soup. I wanted to ask you about Paris and the fact that you're not going to put your shirt on it. So do you think climate is too important to be left in the hands of government? And what kind of alliances do you think we need that move beyond government that might try and solve the climate question?
Very interesting question, and indeed it's one that was addressed by the Martin Commission, which Ian might want to talk about that briefly. But I think the issue is really is to do with numbers. If you think about the number of states and the number of NGO participants in the recent Conference of the Party summits that we've actually seen, you're talking about thousands of people, all lobbying, all talking amongst each other, with some senior states slightly holding the ring. I find that very hard to think that is actually going to lead to some form of consensus decision. So one of the things that when the Martin Commission suggested it is that you move to alternative groups. Well, it could be bilateral or small numbers of countries. And one of the sort of interesting developments in the end of last year was an agreement between China and the USA to limit per capita emissions in China and to limit total emissions in the USA. And that's the sort of thing that you can see two major superpowers kind of agree. And frankly, if China and America agree to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I ain't too bothered of persuading Latvia that they really need to do it, or indeed the United Kingdom. So there's things like that, but also I think that the cities are really important. And I think that if there could be, one is talking about the mega cities, cities do produce a very, very high proportion of greenhouse gas emissions and our energy usage. So agreements from cities to actually change, for example, having urban plans that are not like Atlanta, but like Barcelona, would make one enormous difference to it. That's the sort of thing that I think, but Ian, you should expand on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on across the Oxford Martin School on climate, and this seminar series is partly trying to reflect that. But the Oxford Martin Commission, which is a very interesting group chaired by Pascal Lamy, included Nick Stern and Michelle Bachelet and Liu He as the most senior Chinese minister for planning, came up with a recommendation which is called C20-30-40, which is, the basic principle is that about a dozen countries account for 90% of emissions. And so you don't actually need 202 countries to agree to get an effective thing. And even within those countries that don't necessarily support it, like say the US, there's a small number of states and cities who do support significant changes, like New York, California, Illinois, etc., who could make an enormous difference. And there's also an enormous number of countries where there are companies and cities. So the idea is that you'd get cities and companies together, and we're doing that. And the C40 Alliance of Cities is moving and making some very strong commitments. There's a strong group of companies that are doing it. And then you'd make a demand to the G20 group of countries. So that process is one that we are trying to drive. But it's very much this philosophy of trying not only to push Paris, which we will support very strongly, but also think about how one might go beyond it. Because if it comes out with a weak solution, you want to achieve much more. The gentleman at the back. Sorry, your mic's not working.
Could you put the mic on and speak a bit louder? Carl?
Okay. Hello, my name is Ibrahim Yauza. I'm a crop scientist. You stated that agriculture contributes about 24% of greenhouse gas emission. But it's also a fact that agricultural sector, and if I'm saying agriculture now, I'm including forestry, is seen as one of the key sectors that is often targeted to mitigate greenhouse gas emission. So I want to know what percentage of the greenhouse gas emission that is emitted by agriculture is mitigated by the practices, especially those in using organic farming and so on and so forth, that is mitigated by those practices used in agriculture, or do the greenhouse gas emission that is emitted by other sectors, not necessarily in agriculture, is it also emitted, is it also mitigated by practices in agriculture? I just want a sort of percentage, because you give percentage that is contributed. I want to have a percentage, idea of percentage that is being mitigated by practices used in agriculture.
I think one of the first things which would make a big difference is to stop chopping down forests to actually move to arable land. And that was the practice very much in the 20th century, and has been slowed to an extent here. I think the other thing is the sort of slightly fallacious idea that somehow one should move towards, that one should try to somehow ban livestock. And because livestock had because of the rumen, produced significant amounts of greenhouse gas emissions in the form of methane. But very large proportions of the world can only support livestock. And so this would be a fallacious way to develop agriculture. I think that what one does need to be thinking about is agricultural interventions that are actually, and the lady raised the issue earlier on, which are climate smart. Think about things that actually involve an agricultural practice which is not ruinous to the farmers, but which means less energy, less water, less fertilizer to an extent. And I think there are both conventional breeding, for example, of plant breeding, guided by genomics, is producing a whole series of crops which actually enable this to be a reasonable thing to address. I think that there are real hopes for that. And I think the other issue is that we need to be thinking, and I mentioned it in answer to this gentleman on the right here, is I do think that wastage, whether in fact it's loss due to pests and disease, or whether it's losses due to storage, poor storage, are something that could be an intervention that would really make agriculture significantly more effective. There's an odd irony too, is that in the developing world, about 30% is lost prior to harvest at the farm gate, and in the developed world, about 30% is lost after purchase because people buy too much and throw it away. This is the sort of thing that one can look to actually change, and I think that one needs to be thinking hard about those sorts of issues. But a very good question.
The woman over here.
Hello, thank you for a great talk. I just wanted to ask a bit more on the solution side. I'm Helen from the Global Canopy Programme, and I lead our work on water, energy and food in Latin America. So in Latin America, it's resource abundant, and water and agricultural commodities are exported to markets in Europe and America. I wanted to ask you, what do you see the role of companies, the finance sector, and governments and consumer markets like the EU in promoting more resource efficiency and resource stewardship?
Yeah, well, the governments can do a number of things. One of them is obviously a taxation, and the other is some degree of encouragement via subsidies or incentives, and those are pretty much all it can do. But also fund research which would not be funded by commercial interests. So I think those are the sort of three things they could do. I think that if we look down the tracks, I think water is going to be coming up as a massive issue. So I think that, we now see air miles and sort of the number of greenhouse gas emissions that have been generated by a particular product, whether it's flying beans from Kenya to go on the shelves in Oxford or otherwise. But I think that we are probably going to see footprints that are actually really quite important. And this sort of mad irony is, you know, where is cotton grown? Cotton is grown in some of the driest countries in the world. We import vast amounts of cotton and essentially have a very, very large water footprint, which is being generated from countries like Egypt, which the last thing they have is sufficient water. So there's some very interesting things that can be done with trade. I think that hopefully, as one sees these problems develop, and I don't think that you'll get retailers or indeed governments taking a stance until there are problems. I'm afraid I'm cynical enough to believe that. It would be nice if we had sort of philosopher kings who thought deeply into the future, but at the moment we don't.
One over here.
Hi, I'm just a first-year undergrad, but you talked a bit about increases in urbanization and population leading to a lot of new cities springing up, and about relative efficiency and impact or environmental impact that different cities can have. Are there any plans to try to minimize the impact that all of these new cities will have, or kind of design of them? And if not, is there any way we can make that more of a priority?
I think that there are some issues that are in the developed world of trying to make cities more efficient, and that really is quite a big deal. People are trying to do it. In the developing world, I'm afraid at the moment, I suspect that you're going to see urbanization developing as a free-for-all, and you need to be thinking about some of the big issues. So, for example, can one think about a sustainable water and food supply for urban development that's occurring in West Africa? Only if one actually has some very significant development, and you don't ignore it. The tragedy, for example, of northwest India is that the aquifers that are being overexploited were actually subsidized by the Indian government, who actually subsidized the fuel to use pumps to go deeper and deeper. So there's sort of sadnesses that make you feel wistful. Wouldn't it be a good idea if they hadn't done that? But these are sort of political pressures that occur. I think one of the things that is going to be interesting is that because of the increasing move to cities and the political power held by urban people, I think you are going to see quite a change in the balance of power. You know, you don't get riots being generated in a small village. You do get political change occurring with sort of civil unrest in cities. So I think that these are the sort of things that are happening. And at the same time, I think you're going to be thinking about commercial organizations, you know, where are the supermarkets? Where are people going to get food in 1,000 cities in Africa? It will be commercial organizations will provide food. And what we need to do is make certain that food is not very poor nutrition, either in terms of making people fat or just insufficient calorific content. But you're young enough, you know, you've got 10 years before you have to, but you know, I think we need informed people to work on these problems and actually support organizations that actually try to make. And I think that is the hope, really. And I think I'll have a knock at because I'm afraid that I think some of the NGO organizations are actually anti-science, anti-technology in a way that I think is pernicious. And I won't say that about Prince Charles, because that's treason.
One quick last question and a relatively quick answer. The woman over there.
Hello, thank you. I'm Rebecca White, currently unemployed. Perhaps leading on from your point just now, and you mentioned the worry you have about sort of distrust of science and some technologies in, let's say we're talking about the EU. I think that's partly perhaps related to the fact that there are interests, economic interests, other interests in science and technology as well, and perhaps that's not always acknowledged, or maybe we don't have a sensible way of talking about that and acknowledging that. So I guess my question is, do you think that our institutions of science and technology are up to scratch in terms of transparency, democracy, engagement, or are there improvements that we can make?
I think it's a very good question, because of course one of the concerns about the early introduction of GM was that essentially it was providing a monopoly power to a certain number of companies, which could therefore expand that. And I think the overuse of pesticides, which were not properly tested, which were occurring in the last few decades of the 20th century, brought that mistrust. I think it's probably gone a bit far. And I think the key thing is the word you use, which is transparency. And I think that what one should be trying to do is, if there is evidence, that should be discussed. And of course, the climate change dimension, there are a number of scientists who don't think climate change is happening, but they're a tiny, tiny proportion. In the same way, I think one should be thinking about, the consensus is not always right. There's this phenomenon which I call the Galileo effect, which is that Galileo was a genius and he disagreed with the consensus of his time. However, it doesn't imply if you disagree with the consensus, you're a genius. And I think that's the sort of issues that we need to do. But transparency and debate is the way to try to get these things to work. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm tired.
Just before we thank you and let you go, so this is a really wonderful example of the seminar series that we have. If you haven't been attending other seminars, this time every week. Next week we will have Professor Jim Hall on water and climate change. The week after that we will have Natalie Seddon on biodiversity and climate change, and the week after that we'll have Simon Caney on human rights and climate change. So it will carry on for many more weeks to come, but we do encourage you to come back for more on this topic. We also have a really interesting series of exceptional events coming. On Monday, we have Dame Sally Davies, who's the UK government's Chief Medical Officer, at 5:30 at exam schools, and you'll have to register for that, and you're going to have to get there early if you registered to get guaranteed a seat on antimicrobial resistance. On the 4th of March, that's next Wednesday, we have Professor Vlatko Vedrol, who's the co-director of our program on bio-inspired quantum technologies. If you don't understand quantum and you don't understand its relationship to the natural world, come here, Vlatko, on Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Tom Friedman, who you know is the Pulitzer Prize winner author of The World is Flat, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, and many other books, and New York Times columnist. So Tom Friedman is going to be spending time here at the school, and he's going to give a public talk on the 27th of April at 5 p.m. Entitled Not the World is Flat, but the World is Fast. So this is the new work that he's doing, and look at our website for the venue. Connie Hedegaard, you know, is the former European Commission for Climate Action, was the European Commissioner for many years, is going to give the inside view answering this question about the politics of climate change here on the 18th of March at 5 o'clock. Molly John on the 20th of May on food and feeding the world, and Chris Woods on secret drones on the 27th. You won't remember all of that, but it's on our website, oxfordmartin.ox.ac.uk. So thanks, John, for a really excellent talk, and thanks for being our advisor and helping us on these matters.